Hello everyone, my name is Alessandra Galloni. I am Editor-in-Chief of Reuters, and I am here today with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Thank you, Secretary General, for joining us today on a day of another dramatic development in the war in Ukraine. So let's jump right in. Today, just a few hours ago, Putin said in a speech that if the territorial integrity of Russia is threatened, we will use all available means to protect our people. This is not a bluff. Is Putin bluffing?
This is dangerous and reckless nuclear rhetoric. It's not new, as he has done it many times before. He knows very well that a nuclear war should never be fought and cannot be won, and it will have unprecedented consequences for Russia. And therefore, NATO has also increased its military presence, especially in the eastern part of the alliance, to remove any room for miscalculation or misunderstanding in Moscow.
So he has raised the prospect, as you say, but what would NATO do if Russia used a nuclear weapon on Ukraine?
We will make sure that there is no misunderstanding in Moscow about exactly how we will react. Of course, depends on what kind of situation and what kind of weapons they may use. The most important thing is to prevent that from happening, and that's the reason why we have been so clear in our communications with Russia about the unprecedented consequences, about the fact that the nuclear war cannot be won by Russia. And of course also why we have increased the readiness of our forces, the presence of NATO troops in the eastern part of the alliance, and also why we are communicating clearly that we monitor very closely what Russia does. So far we have not seen any changes in the nuclear posture, the nuclear readiness, but we monitor this very closely and we stay vigilant.
I want to get back to the readiness on both sides in just a minute, but in terms of this week, these hours, you know, we are here in New York and there is, of course, the United Nations General Assembly. Are you thinking, as NATO, of calling an extraordinary meeting to discuss the last few hours, just so the heads of government can get together and think of a response?
The speech is an escalation, but it is not a surprise. Therefore, we have been prepared. We will stay calm and continue to provide the support to Ukraine. The speech of President Putin demonstrates that the war is not going according to President Putin's plans. He has made a big miscalculation. He thought he was able to take control of Ukraine within days. He was actually forced to move out of northern Ukraine, the areas around Kiev. Then he launched a big offensive in Donbass. That offensive has been stalled by the Ukrainian forces. And now actually the Ukrainians have been able to liberate territory. So the speech, the partial mobilization of the armed forces of Russia just demonstrate that he miscalculated, he made a big mistake, strategic mistake, and that's the reason why they know how to do this.
Let's talk a little bit then about Russia's preparedness. In your view, how does these new 300,000 reservists change the equation? How do you evaluate their training, their ability, their morale, and how will they contribute to the current Russian forces?
So first of all, I think we should be careful about the exact numbers, but of course any mobilization will add to the number of troops and forces they have. That will take time and they will require equipment, and what we have seen so far is that the Russian troops are ill-equipped. They lack proper command and control, and they also have struggled a lot with logistics. But of course, more troops will escalate the conflict. That will mean more suffering, more loss of lives, Ukrainian lives, but also Russian lives. President Putin can end this war by withdrawing his forces, by stopping invading another country. this is a blatant violation of international law. And therefore, the NATO message is that we must continue to support Ukraine, and we must impose sanctions on Russia, and we must mobilize the whole international community. That's also something we address here at the UN, to clearly condemn the Russian invasion of a neighbor, Ukraine.
You talk about a miscalculation. What has surprised you the most about Russia's military weakness?
I think the totality of the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces, the unity of the Ukrainian society, the courage of their armed forces, but also the fact that President Putin totally underestimated NATO and partners and the international community, because he thought that we were not going to step up and provide as much support to Ukraine as we have and will continue to do. NATO and NATO allies are not party to the conflict, but we support Ukraine to help them to uphold the right for self-defense, a right which is enshrined in the UN Charter, and we are here at the UN. And of course, to help a country defend themselves against an aggressor, that's something which is absolutely in line with accordance with international law, and that's exactly what we are doing.
So, of course, as you say, the response has been unprecedented, if you will, both in terms of military and economic responses from the West. But you have talked about the fact that NATO is running low on weapons itself. So you've talked about this a little bit. Can you give us more detail about what exactly, therefore, NATO needs to do to replenish the weapon systems? Do you talk with industry about ramping up production? Are there other emergency measures? What in specific have you called on the nations?
Of course, we are now talking to industry. At NATO, we're talking to the different nations, but also directly to the industry. And nations and NATO are now in close dialogue with the defense industry to scale up production, to provide more ammunition and more weapons, because we need that to replenish our own stocks, to ensure our own deterrence and defense of NATO territory, but also to enable us to continue to support Ukraine. In the first months, of course, almost all came from our own stocks. Now we have provided unprecedented support, especially the United States, but also other allies, have now delivered a lot of weapons and ammunition to Ukraine, but also fuel, other types of support. And therefore we have reduced our own stocks. We need stocks to be prepared. And that's the reason why we now are engaging deeply and heavily with the industry. We will have a meeting soon at NATO with what we call the national armament directors from all the 30 NATO allies. We're also working with partner nations, and I will also meet some of the major defense industries in Brussels, and then we will discuss how we can ramp up production, as we did, for instance, when we have the corona, the COVID, and then the world was able to ramp up production of actually new vaccines. And this is about increasing production of ammunition, and something we have done for many, many years. And that's extremely important also to give the industry some predictability, so they are willing to invest in new production lines. To do so, they need some kind of predictability that this will be a demand also into the future.
So you've been talking about, if you will, emergency measures, but what about more broadly the 2% minimum of GDP on defense spending? Does this need to be hiked now?
At least we have to deliver on that, and we need to regard the 2% guideline, spending 2% of GDP on defense, more as a floor than a ceiling. The reality is that NATO was prepared when Russia invaded in February this year, partly because this is not the first time Russia invades or uses military force against Ukraine. The war didn't start in February this year. It started in 2014. and since 2014, NATO allies have implemented the biggest reinforcement of collective defense since the end of the Cold War. For the first time in our history, we have combat-ready battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance. We have tripled the size of the NATO Readiness Force. We have deployed more pre-positioned equipment in Europe and in the eastern part of the alliance. The US has increased their presence, military presence in Europe. And allies have started to invest more. Before 2014, defense budgets were going down across Europe and Canada. Since 2014, all NATO allies have increased defense spending, and more allies are meeting the 2% guideline. So, and then last fall, we had very precise intelligence saying that President Putin was planning for a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We warned allies, we shared that intelligence. That's something we normally don't do. And so we had very specific intelligence from the fall until the invasion. So when they invaded, we further increased readiness, we further deployed even more forces to the east of the alliance, but we were not surprised. We had been preparing and planning for this actually for many years, and especially since we received a very specific intelligence last fall.
What about the state of nuclear readiness, and not just readiness, but willingness on the part of NATO?
Nuclear is part of our deterrence, but the purpose of deterrence is to prevent conflict, is to ensure that we never use nuclear weapons. And NATO is a defensive alliance. NATO's purpose is to preserve peace, and we have done that for more than 70 years. First 40 years during the Cold War. Of course, then we had nuclear threats. We had crises like the Cuba Missile Crisis, but the unity, the predictability, the fact that any potential adversary, then the Soviet Union, knew that an attack on one NATO ally will trigger a response from the whole alliance, one for all for one, which is NATO's core idea, has prevented any attack on any NATO ally. And that is even more important now. When we live in more dangerous times, as we do now, with the biggest war in Europe since the Second World War, with the ramifications for the rest of the world with food and energy prices, with the crisis we recently saw in Taiwan or around Taiwan, that makes it even more important to have strong international institutions like the UN, but also like NATO, and therefore we are investing more in NATO, and allies are really stepping up.
You called out one ally in particular, obviously the United States. How much do you think that the participation and determination of the US is reliant on the political cycle and, let's say, the midterm elections?
What we see is very strong bipartisan support for NATO in the United States. We just saw a new opinion poll, record high support for NATO in the United States, both from Republicans and from Democrats. The fact is that while there were many discussions during the Trump presidency on climate change and the Iran nuclear deal and trade and many other issues, but on NATO, actually, what we saw was more US presence in Europe. And we had a very strong bipartisan also message then from the Congress that the United States should stay committed to NATO. This is important for European security, but it's also important for the United States. If the United States is concerned about the size of China, then it's even more important to have friends and allies. And no other major power has as many friends and allies as the United States has in NATO. China, Russia doesn't have anything like that. And together we are 50% of the world's GDP, 50% of the world's military might. So as long as we stand together, North America and Europe in NATO, we are safe. We are able to protect each other against any potential threat.
So you use the word standing together, but is NATO actually united in facing down Putin? I'm thinking Hungary or Turkey, who don't seem to be of the same mindset.
There are differences in NATO. We are 30 allies, soon to be 32 with Finland and Sweden. And of course, throughout our history, we have had differences and disagreements. We had the Suez Crisis in 1956. We have France leaving the military cooperation in NATO in the 1960s. We had the disagreements on the Iraq war. Some allies were in favor, some allies were against. So yes, there are differences also today, but NATO's success is that despite those differences, we have always been able to unite around the core task, the core responsibility to protect each other. And that is what we do now, with more forces in the eastern part of the alliance, with higher readiness, with new military domains, as we have just established, or established a few years ago in cyber and also in space. So we are doing more together, North America and Europe now, because we need NATO more in a more dangerous world.
You talked about enlargement, which makes me think immediately of Turkey. And, you know, Turkey has been blocking the accession of Finland and Sweden. What is the quid pro quo, and how much are you willing to give Turkey for its support?
All NATO allies, also Turkey, made an historic decision in June this year to invite Finland and Sweden to join NATO. And a few days after, we signed the accession protocol. And now this accession protocol has been ratified in almost all NATO allied parliaments, or parliaments in the NATO allied countries. This is the fastest ever accession process in NATO, so far this has gone very quickly. As part of the agreement, Finland, Sweden and Turkey agreed a common memorandum where they lined out how they will work more closely together, in particular to address terrorist threats. This is a great concern for all allies, but in particular for Turkey. No other country has, no other NATO ally has suffered more terrorist attacks than Turkey. And therefore I welcome that Finland, Sweden and Turkey are now working more closely, exchanging more information, intelligence, addressing issues like expulsion of terrorists. And I'm confident that all allies will ratify. Let me add one more thing, and that is that what has happened so far has really changed the security status for Finland and Sweden already. We have more NATO presence in the region. We have allies like the United States, United Kingdom and others have provided security assurances to Finland and Sweden. The United States and many other allies have ratified the accession protocol. So the reality is that Finland and Sweden is actually already very much integrated into NATO. They participate as invitees in NATO meetings, in NATO ministerials, in the military and political cooperation. So the reality is that through the decision in June, they have already been also very much integrated into NATO.
Mm. Talking of accession, early in the war, the Russian envoy to Ukraine, Dmitry Kozak, tried to broker a deal in which essentially Ukraine would commit to staying out of NATO. Were you part of this attempt for a negotiation, for a deal? And could that be a deal going forward, the commitment of Ukraine?
Ukraine is a sovereign nation and they have the right to choose their own path. Yes, there were negotiations and we welcome those negotiations, but what we have seen is that Russia wants to control at least large parts of Ukraine. There is no indication that they have changed their overall strategic goal to destroy Ukraine as an independent sovereign state in Europe. So hopefully this war will end at the negotiating table, as most other wars do. But what we also know is that to ensure an acceptable outcome of those negotiations for Ukraine, they need to strengthen their position on the battlefield, because it's a very close link between their strength on the battlefield and what they can achieve on the negotiating table. So the way we can help to ensure that there is a acceptable negotiated outcome is to support them on the battlefield.
What is the most promising negotiating table going on right now, specifically?
There are no real negotiations, and that's because Russia insists on controlling Ukraine and to actually grab territory. Also, we haven't seen this in Europe since the Second World War, a full-fledged invasion into a sovereign nation, trying to take control over the territory, and therefore there is no doubt that the best would be for Russia to admit the big strategic failure, to withdraw its forces and then end the war. But we need to understand that this is not kind of equal responsibility. If President Putin stops fighting, there will be peace. If President Zelensky stops fighting, Ukraine will cease to exist as an independent sovereign nation. So we need to support them to enable a political solution.
So there's no scenario to your mind in which what has been gained thus far, and especially in view of these referenda over the next few days, that some sort of an armistice or a deal could be formed with troops as to where they are, or some line of where they have reached?
But that's for Ukraine to decide. Also, we will not decide on behalf of Ukraine. We support them in their undisputed right to defend their own territory. They have been invaded. President Putin tried to take Kiev, to oust the government within days, and then he failed. But still, he tries to take control of Ukraine. So we will support them in those efforts, and that's also the best way to create the conditions for negotiations where Ukraine will prevail as an independent sovereign nation in Europe.
You talk about the determination of Russia, which doesn't seem to be waning in terms of its ambitions. What about the resolve, in particular, of Europe and the European governments in view of a winter, a potentially harsh winter, because of the squeeze on gas supplies? Where do you see that resolve going?
Europeans are going to pay a price. We are paying a price for the war because we're not part of the war, but the war has ramifications, consequences for all of us, with the increase in the gas prices, increase in food prices, inflation. But the alternative, not to support Ukraine, then we risk to pay a much higher price. Because if President Putin wins in Ukraine, then the lesson learned for him, but also for other authoritarian leaders, is that by using brutal military force, by invading a neighbor, they can achieve their goals. Then we will become more vulnerable. So this is about Ukraine's security, but it is about our security. So we pay a price, that's right. At the same time, we need to, and many people suffer, but at the same time, we need to realize that the price we pay can be measured in money, in euros and dollars, while the price the Ukrainians are paying is measured in lives. And we need to ensure that we don't end up in a place where this war escalates.
So you don't see a fraying as the winter months of European unity?
So what we have seen is an unprecedented willingness to stand together, impose sanctions, provide support to Ukraine. Yes, we are prepared for a hard winter. The winter is coming, it's going to be hard for all of us. But the answer is not to step down and to stop supporting Ukraine. The answer, if anything, is to step up and further support Ukraine, because that is, in reality, the only way, the painful way, to a peace solution in Ukraine, which is acceptable for Ukraine and ensures that Ukraine prevails.
You have alluded to other potential conflicts, or the possibility that if Putin prevails, there could be other conflicts. And we are seeing tensions, of course, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. Are you concerned that about instability essentially spreading across Central Asia? Is that something you are looking at and the member states are looking at?
Of course, we are monitoring and following also those conflicts, those tensions very closely. What makes Ukraine different from, as I say, other crises we see is, of course, that this is a full-scale war at NATO's borders, and also that President Putin, when he launched the war, actually didn't only threaten Ukraine, he also threatened NATO. In that big speech, he actually said that he doesn't recognize Ukraine as an independent state, but then he also said that NATO should withdraw all its forces and infrastructure from the eastern part of the alliance, from all those allies that have joined after 1997, meaning to introduce some kind of second-class NATO membership. We can protect West Europe, but not East Europe. NATO can never do that, and that will violate the sovereignty of these countries, that we accept such a demand from Moscow. And the other demand from President Putin was that NATO should have should close its door, no more enlargement and new members. Putin made a big mistake, partly underestimating the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces and underestimating the unity of NATO and partners in providing support to Ukraine, but he also underestimated the consequences when it comes to the willingness to support NATO, because he wanted less NATO on its borders. He's getting more NATO on its borders, partly with more NATO troops in the eastern part of the alliance to remove any room for miscalculation in Moscow, but also by the fact that two countries, Finland and Sweden, that have never applied for NATO membership before, they have now taken a historic decision, applied for membership, and been invited into NATO. So he's achieving the opposite of what he wanted by his war of aggression.
And I'm going to press you again on something I asked you earlier, which is, today Putin has raised rhetoric, has raised the threat level in particular, talking about not bluffing about a nuclear threat. Is the NATO response, is there time, is it the moment for NATO also to raise its rhetoric with a more bold threat of a response?
We are extremely clear on one thing, that we are there to protect and defend all NATO allies and to remove any room for misunderstanding. We don't only say that, but we actually do that by deploying more troops, increasing the readiness, especially in the eastern part of the alliance. NATO is a defensive alliance. We don't see confrontation with Russia. And therefore we will not engage in that same kind of reckless, dangerous nuclear rhetoric as President Putin. He has done this many times before. And our message is the same. We stay calm, we stay vigilant, and we ensure that we have credible deterrence and defense to prevent escalation, to prevent this war from turning to a full-fledged war between Russia and NATO. And NATO allies are not party to the war. We don't have NATO troops in Ukraine, but of course we support Ukraine to defend themselves. That's a kind of moral obligation we have, but it's also in our security interest to prevent Putin from achieving his goal by using brutal military force. Last
question on Russia. What about the longevity of President Putin? There has been criticism internally. There has also been somewhat veiled or less than veiled criticism even from President Xi of Putin. What do you see are the chances of his exiting?
So I will be very careful about speculating. We need to just, as I say, relate to and respond to the facts of what we see. And what we see is aggressive President Putin using military force, mobilizing for additional forces, violating international law, and that's what we have to react to. And then thing may change, but thing may also stay the same for a long time. So we need to be prepared for long haul, and then of course if things change in a positive way earlier, that will be good. But I think it's dangerous to in a way base our assumptions for the future on that will be the case.
Let me switch to China, which you mentioned earlier. How has the war in Ukraine changed your calculus about a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan?
Sorry. Of course, Taiwan and Ukraine are two different cases, but at the same time, we need to realize that if the message the world is sending is that by using military force, authoritarian regimes can achieve what they want, that may also have consequences for the calculus in Beijing about Taiwan. China has not condemned the invasion of Ukraine. And what we have seen over several years is a closer cooperation between China and Russia. They work more together in the diplomatic domain here at the UN, in the economic field, but also in the military area, where we see more exercises. They recently had joint patrols in the Pacific. They participate in each other in military exercises, patrol air, sea, in different parts of the world together. And then we had the joint statement in February, just a few weeks before the invasion, where they stated that their partnership had no limits, and where China, for the first time, actually clearly made demands on NATO, saying that there should be no further NATO enlargement. So, of course, the sum of all this just increases the importance of NATO allies to standing together and realizing that China is part of the security challenges we need to face in the today and in the future.
So just as a follow-up, how large is China's role in this war then?
Well, China has stated that they don't provide direct support, but at the same time, China has not been able to condemn the invasion, and the invasion is a clear violation of international law, and we see that China and Russia are working together in many other areas. Then, also before the war in Ukraine, NATO realized that China is becoming a more and more important part of the security environment we have to respond to. So in the new strategic concept, we agreed at the NATO summit in Madrid, for the first time in our strategic concept, we actually address China. We don't regard China as an adversary. We don't seek confrontation with China. Actually, on the opposite, we think there is room for engagement, dialogue with China on issues from climate change to arms control. At the same time, we are concerned because we see China's strong military buildup with advanced weapons, long-range missiles, very strong increase in their number of nuclear warheads. We see their coercive behavior, not least in the South China Sea, against the neighbors. And we also see the way they violate basic human rights in China. We saw it in Hong Kong. We have seen it against the Uyghurs, and of course, an authoritarian regime that doesn't share values, that soon will have the biggest economy in the world and already has the second largest defense budget. That matters for our security.
Does NATO need to have a bigger presence in the Indo-Pacific?
NATO will remain an alliance of North America and Europe, but this region, this transatlantic region, faces more and more global threats and challenges. During the Cold War, it was in a mainly and almost only the Soviet Union in the Euro-Atlantic region. Over the last decades, we have seen terrorist attacks that brought NATO to Afghanistan on the borders of China or in Asia. We have seen cyber attacks that are truly global. More and more space is important for our security. So China is in many ways coming closer to us. We see it in cyber, we see them in Africa, we see them trying to control our critical infrastructure, 5G, for instance. So the main thing is that we need to protect our infrastructure. We are therefore also doing more when it comes to resilience. We need to maintain our technological edge, and all of this is part of the way we respond to the security consequences of China.
Great. So now we have some questions from our audience. While I pull them up, I do have one follow-up back on Ukraine on a specific, if you could give me, which is what weapons specifically does Ukraine need now? Because so far the West has shied away from certain weapons, so tanks, infantry, fighting vehicles, fighter jets. So what does Ukraine need now, and what does the West need to give?
So we have stepped up both when it comes to the magnitude, but also the quality of the weapons we are providing. We, NATO allies, are providing more and more advanced weapons, and Ukraine needs everything from armored vehicles to precision-guided ammunition to air defense and many other types of weapon. And we are providing them with more and more, not only more weapons, but also more advanced weapons. Then we are in constant dialogue with Ukraine. We recently had a meeting in Ramstein a few weeks ago, where the Ukrainian defense minister was to discuss how we can step up and further support them. And we'll have the NATO defense ministerial meeting in a couple of weeks, where also Ukraine will be present to discuss the specific. So I will not go into exactly what kind of weapons NATO allies will provide, but just look at what we have done so far. You see more advanced weapons, you see more armored vehicles, you see more air defense, you see more also precision-guided systems.
Sorry, could you give us a little bit more detail on what you will provide?
No, but you can just see publicly what we are providing. That is HIMARS, that is artillery, that's howitzers, it's ammunition, it's different types of air defense systems. So yes, that's what we are providing, and will continue to provide. And then we have adjusted, and we will continue to adjust the exact types as we continue to work with Ukraine on the types of weapons we are going to deliver to them.
Okay, a couple of questions, and we've covered some of this ground, so I'll just choose a couple of them. Somebody is asking, at what point is enough enough? What point does it come, when it comes to Putin's ongoing threats, when is escalation from the West a viable option?
But we are not going. We are a defensive alliance. We are not going to threaten Russia. We are going to defend NATO and NATO allies and help Ukraine defend themselves. So we don't seek confrontation. It's Russia that is seeking confrontation. But of course we have to protect ourselves, and we need to help Ukraine. And the help we provide to Ukraine is now making a difference on the battlefield every day. With the new advanced weapons, they have been able to stop the Russian offensive and actually take back, liberate territory.
Second question, what about North Cyprus and the situation with Turkey? Does this impact the war in Ukraine?
No, as there are differences among allies on some of these issues related to Cyprus, but it doesn't reduce our capability to provide support to Ukraine.
Like Russia, NATO member Turkey is doing a military operation in Syria and controls Syrian territory. Why has NATO reacted differently to this than vis-a-vis Russia?
But I think we have to realize that both NATO allies, the United States and many other NATO allies, have had military presence in Syria to fight terrorism. And all NATO allies, the European Union, regard, for instance, PKK as a terrorist organization. So the chaotic and very difficult and dangerous situation in northern Syria is a challenge to all of us. There is no simple solution, but we have seen military presence of several NATO allies in Syria to fight terrorism.
If Russian soldiers encircled or trapped by the recent Ukrainian offensive are indeed negotiating surrender terms, how would Ukraine handle thousands of POWs?
I'm confident that Ukraine will handle that in accordance to international law, to the Geneva Conventions. Again, Ukraine is a sovereign nation. Ukraine has proven that they are a responsible nation, adhering to core principles when it comes to, for instance, international law. We are not on the ground. NATO is not party to the conflict. We support Ukraine because they have been invaded.
More broadly, you've mentioned cyber and space earlier in the conversation. Can you tell us more about how NATO is defending itself against threats in these two areas, so cyber, space?
So we have established what we call military domains, cyber domain and space domain, just because we realized that in addition to the classical traditional air, sea, land, cyber and also more and more space matters for our security. Space, you know, it's critical for communications, for navigation, for all the satellites that are providing you know, support to almost everything we do on Earth. So again, we are defensive. We are coordinating efforts of NATO allies, and we have just visited the NATO Cyber Center we have established in Ramstein. So we are coordinating our efforts to protect key space installations, so critical for both civilian and military infrastructure on Earth. On cyber, again, we have established as a separate military domain. We help allies improve their cyber defenses. We work every day on ensuring proper defenses of our own cyber networks and develop those. And not least, we conduct big exercises, so we share best practices. We have the world's biggest cyber exercises with a lot of allies and partners participating to increase awareness of the risk of cyber attacks, because it is impossible to imagine any big conflict without a huge cyber dimension.
How does this recent Ukraine counteroffensive and now this threat of the last few hours affect the debate on reinforcing NATO's eastern flank? Because some allies want a heavy NATO presence on the border with Ukraine, others are reluctant. How does the last few hours, but also a couple of weeks, affect this?
So we have adjusted according to long-term, the plan that we decided actually a long time ago, and we made decisions also in June to further increase our presence. So we are calm, and we were not surprised by the Russian announcement to partly mobilize the armed forces. So we started to increase our presence in the eastern part of the alliance in 2014. Then over the last year we have further increased our presence, and then at the Madrid summit we agreed plans to add on to that. That will be a combination of three elements: partly more forces in the east, partly higher readiness and earmarked troops, not necessarily deployed in the east. They can be in their home countries in Germany or the United States, but then they are earmarked to specific territories, countries in the east. They train there, they exercise there, they know the infrastructure, and they can be easily deployed, reinforced if needed. And the third element of this strategy is to have more pre-positioned equipment. I think we have seen in the war of Ukraine how important logistics is, how much ammunition, how much fuel, how much heavy stuff you have to move. So the combination of more troops, more pre-positioned equipment, and earmarked ready troops in their home countries, that has and will in the coming months significantly increase our, and especially the eastern flank of the alliance.
Two more questions for you, quick ones. There is some speculation in Europe that after the next year, where you have agreed to stay on, in particular because of the conflict, that Mario Draghi, the outgoing Prime Minister of Italy, former ECB chief, would be a good candidate to succeed you. What do you think?
It's not for me to have any opinion about that. I'm totally focused on my responsibility as Secretary General of NATO now, and then it's for the nations to decide what will happen after that.
And the last question is, let me ask you, what do you personally think, you're clearly an expert, how will this conflict in Ukraine end?
I have to admit that the brutality of this war is something we see every day, but the brutality is also reflected in the fact that it's hard to see a solution in the short term as long as Russia doesn't accept that Ukraine is a sovereign independent nation. So I'm afraid that the only way to end this war is to prove that President Putin will not win on the battlefield. When he realizes that, he has to sit down and negotiate a reasonable agreement with Ukraine. So the reality is that the faster we're able to support and step up support to Ukraine to strengthen their position on the battlefield, the closer and faster we'll come to a negotiated solution on the negotiating table.
But so we, the world, we people, humans, should be prepared for the possibility that this will go on not just weeks or months, but possibly more than that, into years.
Wars are by nature unpredictable. It's about military capabilities, number of tanks, capabilities on the battlefield. It's about morale and fighting spirit and will. And then it's about very complicated political processes. So I think we should all be careful predicting too much, but we need to be prepared for long haul. We need to do the right thing now that maximizes the likelihood for a peaceful solution as soon as possible, and that is to support Ukraine.
But prepared for the long haul.
Absolutely, we need to be prepared for long haul.
All right. Thank you very much, Secretary General. It's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you for the audience. Thank you to the audience for all of your questions, and we will wrap it up here. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.